Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location, and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. Our webinar topic is going to be on baseline schedule metrics. It's going to be presented by Don McNatty, and we have just a couple of items that we'd like to go over for housekeeping before we get started with the presentation. First and foremost, all attendees will be in listen-only or mute mode. This will enable us to
Alice?
provide quality of the audio for our follow-up. If anybody has any questions during today's session, the questions can be submitted through the questions box in your GoToWebinar screen. It should be on the right side of your screen. And time permitting, we're going to try to get to all the questions that are submitted. We will also send a follow-up email to all registrants and attendees of today's webinar that will include a copy of the recording of the webinar, the questions and answers that are submitted, and a copy of today's presentation. We're going to turn the presentation over to Don McNatty. Don, you'll have to unmute your line.
Thank you, Dan. All right, before we get started, a couple of screens that I just want to cover real quick. The safe harbor just means that everything you see is based on our experiences, and you need to make your own judgments as to how you're going to apply it. As far as who we are, many of you have been clients for quite a few years. Some new things this year, of course, are that we're also supporting ESTA Power Project and PM Web software, and our internally developed project status, which is a Java-free risk and collaboration tool that sits on top of P6 Web. One of the things that we provide in all of our seminar slides is a matrix that shows how we see the primary products that we're working with fit into what we do for a living in the project control environment. So there's a lot of information to cover today, so I want to get right into the meat of it. I put this together because I've seen a lot written recently about baseline schedules and how to analyze them and how we do things, and I've also been doing a good number of reviews of baselines for clients and have been a bit disappointed with some of the quality that I see in schedules, and so I thought it might be a good time just to kind of get back to the basics on a lot of things and talk about how we can ensure that the level of quality of what we're putting out in baselines meets at least a minimum level of professional practice. And so that's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to start out with my perspective of what a good project schedule should provide, a definition of an original baseline CPM schedule, what it is, some recommended practices for performing an analysis. Probably going to spend about 90% of our time going over this fourth bullet on baseline schedule metrics, and at the end I'd like to quickly be able to show you some tools that we use for doing that.
Don, do you have the control panel open for your GoToMeeting? Because it's cutting off a portion of the screen.
Sorry. How's that?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. I guess I need to move that over to the other screen. Okay. All right. So what does a good baseline schedule do? Well, when a project manager, has this information, if they know what has to be done, where it has to happen, who's responsible for doing it, and when it has to happen, they've got the core, the foundation information that's needed to control the project. This is a page out of one of our schedule, CPM scheduling basic training manuals. Now, where does the information come from? Well, what has to be done should be covered on the activity description. And that activity description should also include the where. So if I'm doing form work at wall A, form work wall B, but I also use an activity code to be able to group and sort my activities by physical location to support that. Who's responsible for doing it? There should be one party that has responsibility for making that activity happen, so the project manager knows who it is they need to be talking to make sure that this work happens on the dates that are calculated in the schedule. So to me, that is just the basically what a good project schedule needs to produce. Now, how about a baseline critical path method schedule? In this presentation, I'm dealing with original baseline schedule. I'm not dealing with updates. I'm not dealing with rebaselining or revisions to the baseline, but the original baseline schedule, because this is the starting point for everything that we do. Sorry about that. The schedule should represent how the contractor, and I'm looking at this as an owner or a CM that's receiving schedules from a contractor, and then, you know, depending on where you are in the food chain of our industry, you might look at these things just a little bit differently. But I wanted to make sure you understand I'm looking at getting a schedule from a contractor, and this is what I expect to see. So the schedule should be in alignment with the bid and the plans and specifications. So it should include everything that has to be done. Okay, and this presentation is applying just to an original baseline, not to revised or updates like I said before. Also, the word baseline here is not the same as what P6 calls a copy of a schedule that you can compare to. You know, back in the P3 days, they called, when you compared one schedule to another, it was taking a current schedule and comparing it to a target. And that's the way it should be today too, but for whatever reason it isn't. So they use the word baseline kind of loosely in some of the scheduling tools out there today. So it should include 100% of the scope. Now, another thing that I think is very important in original baseline, especially for a contractor, is to include any significant work activity that's going to be or needs to be performed by someone else that's involved in the project that could impact the contractor's schedule. So even though this isn't the contractor's work, it could have an impact on it. And my perspective is it's in the contractor's best interest to get visibility on that up front. We talked about having a singular responsibility for each activity that can help drive the level of detail that you go to. For instance, I had a contractor that had an activity called Bridge Number 1. Well, Bridge Number 1 had probably half a dozen subcontractors involved in it, and so that activity really wasn't detailed enough to provide any level of control. Need to comply with the contract and the specifications for the schedule submittal. They oftentimes can be different. And we want to see a clearly defined critical path, which is the longest path from the start to the end of the project. What should the submittal include? Okay, well, there should be a written narrative. And it's amazing how it's like pulling teeth today still to get a narrative to accompany a schedule. A narrative is, in the contractor's own words, a description of how they're going to approach and build this project. I think it's very important that the narrative become part of that original submittal. We need an electronic file, whether it's a P6 XER, XML, or if it's an ASTA or a Microsoft project, God forbid, schedule file that has been properly built and calculated before it's submitted. I also like to see, even though some people feel they don't really need it if they've got the electronic file, but I like to see printed reports and graphics. And most specifications do cover this. And the main reason for this is that I want to make sure that what I'm looking at on my screen, especially after the schedule is calculated, which I deal with down below, that it matches the same information that are coming out in the printed reports, because if they don't, we have a problem, and that could be the basis for not accepting the schedule. The reviewer process, if I'm the reviewer, the first thing I need to do is make sure I've got a good understanding of the contract documents and what's going to be required. When I receive an electronic file, I make a copy of it and calculate it. I never calculate the original file that I received. That's, to me, destroying evidence. So I make a copy, calculate it, compare it to the original, including the reports, submitted reports and graphics. If there's a change, that means that something happened. Either something was changed in the schedule before, after it was calculated, but before it was backed up and given to you, or you may have messed it up when you imported it, especially into P6, if you don't know how to deal with calendars properly when you're importing a P6 schedule into a database that was not the one that it was originally created in. So you could have created some changes in the schedule yourself without even knowing it. Once I know I've got a good copy, then I spend the time to review the narrative, make sure I have an understanding of my expectations of what I'm going to see in the schedule, make a note of any issues or concerns that I want to look for as I go through the review of the schedule. I then check and verify the software options, simple things like changing the calculation mode from retained logic to progress override could have an impact, not on a original baseline, but on subsequent updates. It could very well have an impact. And most of all, I need to verify the calendars and make sure that when I imported the schedule that I didn't use some default calendar that changed what was on the import. Your schedule specs should be specifying that the contractors use project level schedules and calendars, not global calendars when they're putting their schedules together. That way their calendar can come in and you can be relatively assured that nothing's going to change in it. Then we get down to the real work, is to develop, check, and document baseline schedule metrics. Okay? A good reference for this process is recommended practice number 78R13, which is available on the AACE website. There's a link that you can go to. If you're an AACE member, you can access it and download this and many other recommended practice documents. Okay? But for today, what we're going to focus on in this presentation is just the developing, checking, and documenting metrics. Metrics can be across the project. They could be activity level. They could be related to codes and WBS, relationships and constraints, with the last two being sometimes the hardest to really understand what the impacts are. And for those, I've added some additional graphic detail to help to explain them. How many activities do I need? Well, you need enough activities for you to be able to manage risk. Now, who are you? If I'm a contractor, I may have, on a bonded project, I might have the highest level of risk here, and so I need to have a level of detail that lets me control who does what, where, and when. If I'm an owner or a CM and I've bonded the work to a contractor, I might not need the same level of detail. And it's not uncommon to have a contractor original baseline that's used to update a construction management or an owner's original baseline. There could be two baselines on a schedule. So the things that we want to look at is, how long is the project, how many updates are there going to be, how complex is the work, how much risk do you have. There's really no set, cut and dried figure that if it's this much money for this much of a period of time, you should have these many activities. There are some tools like Deltek Acumen, which maintains on the cloud a database of benchmark information that you can compare your schedule to see whether you are more detailed, less detailed than what the average schedule is within your particular market. Percentage of critical and near critical activities. If over half the activities in the schedule are critical or near critical, then you might want to take the time to understand why. some types of projects, especially, my background is heavy highway and underground utility, linear projects where I've got multiple crews chasing one another down the alignment of a project. And the crew work might merge frequently, come together to maybe go to a next stage or a next phase of the work. And in those cases, you tend to have a lot more critical activities than I might on, let's say, a general building project. So these are things that we want to look at. There could be reasons, good reasons, why most of the schedule is critical or non-critical. We're going to cover excessive logic ties when we go through relationships. Don't forget that if the contract documents include mid-project milestones, those milestone dates could be forcing disjointed critical paths across the project, so you need to look at that. Ideally, less than 15 to 20% of the schedule critical. Talking about days, an activity that is 20 days duration could go from 20 days of float to 0 float in 1 month if it doesn't start. So even something that's 4 weeks away from being critical can bite you within a very short period of time if you're not paying attention to it. Another good metric to look at is the distribution of activities, the number of activities that are active each month over the course of the project, and just see what it looks like. I mean, it should be kind of growing and then kind of scaling down towards the end of the project. But here I got a big gap. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So why is there a gap just when you got going? So I'd want to understand that. A spike, is it feasible? November's a holiday month. Usually you do less work in November than you do in October. Are there resources available to almost triple the work effort? Here, December, January, February. I'm from Buffalo. There's not a lot of work that gets done in winter, except for maybe some snow plowing. So that could be winter shutdown, but you need to check these things. And here's one that's all too often we see is in the last month or two of the project, suddenly you got all this work going on. Well, that could be the result of someone trying to fit the schedule within a time period, and it just might not be realistic, and you need to address that during the original baseline review. Contractual milestones, well, we always look for at least 2, notice to proceed, or substantial or final completion. Need to check the contract documents. You might have liquidated damages that are driven by your substantial completion date. You may have administrative LDs that are driven by your final completion date. So there could be 2 things that drive the critical path on the project. Other milestones that are defined by the contract documents. I mentioned before they could interrupt the smooth flow of a critical path or the longest path through the project, so you need to check those out. A contractor may want to include some of their own milestones in a project where there's key handoffs to other parties. That should not be discouraged, it should be understood. The project starts with a notice to proceed. That's usually when the project time commences, and we usually do that with a milestone. The date on the schedule on an original baseline should be the same as the NTP. We have seen instances where a contractor wants to document actual pre-contract work that was performed in the original baseline, and as long as these actual dates are before the NTP, there could be nothing at all wrong with going along with that. The project completion date. Well, P6 has a must-finish by date field that is commonly thought to be the best way of defining the end date of the project. I actually like to use a finish no later than constraint to manually drive it back, especially if, let's say I have a substantial completion date, but I'm going to have work going on after substantial completion that's not necessarily on the critical path. So if the way that this is being done is not defined in the specifications, that should be discussed as part of your submittal process. I like the milestone because it does give me very specific control of how the float is going to be calculating on the schedule. Now, there's a lot of metrics that are at the activity level. We're going to cover all of these in the next few screens. Blank or missing start and finish dates. Well, you might think, well, that can't happen. Well, I could have an activity that's not a milestone, but for some reason got defined as a milestone. So it's only going to have a start or a finish date, but it's not a milestone, so I need to look into it. Finish dates are earlier than start dates, which causes negative float. Usually you don't want to have negative float in a original baseline. I have seen it happen though, so that's why I use the word usual, where parties agreed to disagree, accepted the original baseline that the contractor maintained could not be met, and they moved forward from there. I don't like to see actuals in original baseline unless they're before the NTP date. And one of the problems you have is a lot of times the work has already started and is underway, and the scheduler is putting together the original baseline, and the project manager is going, well, that's done, that's done, that's done. I want to mark as done. Well, maybe your PMP certification didn't thoroughly explain how an original baseline works from a technical perspective. And so those actuals should be part of the first update, not the original baseline. And also take a good look at activities that are starting on the data date, because activities that have no predecessors and no constraints will start on the data date, and it could just be not something that was intended. So you want to take a look at that. Sorry if I'm going a little bit fast. We've got a lot to cover today, and I'd like to be able to get into a couple of the software tools and take a few minutes to show you how to use these tools to come up with some of these metrics that we discussed. Activity type. Most scheduling tools will allow for different activity types. The default, or the most commonly used one in P6, is task dependent. This allows the scheduler to specifically define the duration, define any constraints, and define any calendars. When you have a resource dependent type and the activity is resource loaded, that resource dependent could allow the resources calendar to drive the activity, and that might not be what you really intended to have happen. So if I have resource dependent but I'm not resource loaded, then it probably isn't going to have any impact. And I've seen this happen where parts of the schedule might have been done by someone else in another tool and then imported, and so they come in as resource dependent and probably should be changed to task dependent before the original baseline has been submitted. Take a look at level of effort or hammock activities depending on the tool that you're using, and make sure that the durations are based on the relationships with other activities. Usually I want a start to start and a finish to finish to drive that summary level. Another thing to look for is duration type. In P6, fixed duration in units allows the scheduler to physically enter activity duration and resource units, and then they just get spread over the duration. If you use any other type of duration type, it could cause recalculations that you aren't really aware of. And I don't always like it when the scheduling tool does something for me, especially if it hasn't told me what it just did that changed what I just entered. So to keep things simple, I like to go with task-dependent activities with fixed duration and units. Percent complete types. I like physical because it can be entered directly and based on judgment. You know, oftentimes in doing an update, we go around to the project managers, we ask them what the percent complete is, and that's what gets put in. Ideally, I like using steps where I define the rules for how an activity is going to be have its performance measured. Steps are also good earned value measurement. If I use units or duration, then the percent complete is going to be driven either by the usage of resources, which adds a level of complexity that many schedulers really aren't prepared to completely handle, and also the duration percent complete is just the passage of time. And the passage of time is not necessarily a good indicator of what percent complete an activity really is. And if you have various of these, and you could do a layout in P6 organized by percent complete type, and I can see, you know, if I've got a lot of activities of different types, I really want to talk with the scheduler and find out what they're thinking or not. Calendars. Calendars are one of the biggest causes of problems and confusion in schedules. And usually it's because of a lack of understanding how calendars work, especially in P6. I mentioned before that you could import someone's schedule, and if they used a global calendar with the same name as a global calendar you have, your global calendar takes over. It could have different work days, different holidays, and as soon as you calculate, everything goes different than it was when the schedule was actually submitted. So you need to be aware of that and aware of how schedule or calendars work within the scheduling tool you're using. The other thing I see is even though a schedule is not resource loaded, people will change their calendars to 10-hour days and 8-hour days. But if you're not resource loading a schedule, a day is a day. It really doesn't matter to the scheduling tool whether it's an 8-hour day, a 4-hour day, a 10-hour day. The problem is that when an 8-hour a day activity hands off to a 10-hour a day activity, so I have an activity that ends at 5, hands off to an activity that can work until 6, that successor activity ends up starting at 5 o'clock, and you end up with fractional durations in your schedule. And a lot of people don't know this. And if you go into user preferences and turn on decimals for your display, you might be surprised at what you see. 149.55 days. Starting at 8 a.m., that's good. That's better than this activity that started at 9:36 a.m. I don't think you're really calculating to this level. You know, if you're doing turnarounds, you're scheduling to the hour. If you're doing general building construction, you're scheduling by the day. Keep it simple. And it's sometimes just importing from another tool and the differences in the calendars can cause this to happen. I've also seen it happen where someone changes the calendars after they've already built a schedule based on 8-hour days. They go back and change it to 10-hour days. You look at the durations. They still look like, 80 hours is 10 days, so it says 10 days. But if you look at the dates, they're only 80 hours apart, and you've effectively just accelerated your schedule by 20%. Don't even know it. And so you need to be careful of how you're using calendars in the schedule. And if you're reviewing it, make sure that someone didn't shoot themselves in the foot with the way that they set up their calendars. Because eventually they're going to figure out that their baseline's been accelerated 20% and that they're not going to be able to meet those dates. Negative float in the baseline submittal indicates that something's not going to happen on time. So a milestone of the project completion isn't going to happen on time. You usually want to identify it, understand it, and eliminate it. Now, I did say that I have seen an original baseline that was accepted with negative float because there was a disagreement. The two parties agreed to disagree, but went forward with the original baseline saying that the project couldn't be done on time. Activity ID structure, I think this is a very important one. By putting an intelligent activity ID structure, it doesn't have to be too complicated. But if you If you use an intelligent structure, it can make it easier for you to find and sort similar activities to work with them as a group. You should try to insist that the structure be consistent across the entire schedule. You don't want to have a bunch of activities that are defined by right justified numerics, and then another part of the schedule is defined by some alpha code setup. And the biggest problems that you get when the activity ID is not finalized, when the structure is not finalized in the baseline, is in some future update, the scheduler decides, well, I gotta get all my activity IDs organized, so I'm going to renumber them. And as soon as they do that, the baseline is useless because the activity IDs no longer relate to one another. The same thing happens when I delete activities. Once activities are gone, new ones are added, baseline is useless. There are accepted practices that can maintain the validity of the baseline while still allowing you to add additional detail to a schedule as the project moves forward. You should understand what those practices are. Activity durations, run a layout organized by duration. If you've got a lot of very long durations, take a look at them. I've got a bunch of 1, 2, 3 day activities, especially on a very large, long duration project. This might be more detailed than is really needed. You need to take a look at that. Just remember that any work activity that exceeds 2 months, 44 days, could be, it could span 3 different monthly updates, and your progress measurement could be an issue. That's why we see a lot of specifications that ask for a maximum of 20 days on physical work activities. I've got a lot of activities that have 5-day durations. I take a look at them because 5 days is the P6 default. And someone could have created a bunch of activities and put in logic ties and not taken the time to think through their durations. And so you want to double check that. 0 duration activities that are not milestones, they should be looked at. Long durations and odd numbers, 323 days, really? How did you arrive at that? Okay, so I might ask that question. The same thing when I see I've got a bunch of activities that have 100 days. Well, is that just a swag number that's going to change in the future? How did this get defined? I want to ask that question. Also, be aware of the rolling wave where the first 6 months of activities in the schedule are very detailed, but the next 18 months is not very detailed. That is okay, that's acceptable practice, and there are good best practice approaches for still maintaining the validity of the baseline when you add more detail down the line. But you do want to be aware of that and be prepared for it and make sure that you've got a best practice in place that's going to preserve the validity of the original baseline when new activities get added to provide more detail in the future. Blank descriptions. I once had to do training for a group that were on a weapons depot, and they insisted that they could not learn the software unless they used their own schedules for the training. But because I didn't have a top secret clearance, they had to delete all the durations. I guess they found it useful. I don't know. But blank descriptions should be, every activity needs to have a description. It should be a good description that tells me what's being done and where it's going to happen. Duplicates. If I have a list of activities called form work, that doesn't really tell me much. If it says form work at wall A100, which is different than wall A200, then it becomes more unique and clearly defines the what and the where. I also look for my substantial completion or final completion activity that denotes the end of contract time period from which I would want to see my float calculated on the project. So I need to understand what that activity is. Some additional activity analysis metrics. I'll talk about activity and WBS codes. They're pretty much one and the same, the way that we look at them, and then we'll get into relationships, leads, lags, and constraints, which can be more difficult to understand. Now, I know that one scheduler, he's got a layout that he runs so he can identify what activities have not been coded, but not all codes apply to all activities on a schedule, but we do want to know where there are blanks to make sure that the original baseline is not missing something that should be there. Okay, code descriptions, just like activity descriptions, whether it's an activity code or WBS code, you need to have a good description that tells us valuable information about, important information about what this code or what this WBS is about. In the same duplicate, formwork, add the, I usually look at adding the location to the description so that I've got uniqueness. So I like to see unique descriptions that communicate better, especially when we're doing summary presentations of a schedule. Summary activities, I like to know how many level of effort or hammock or WBS activities I have in the schedule, review them, how they're being used. They should be a small percentage of the total. I also like on a hammock or level of effort, look for the start to start and the finish to finish relationships to make sure that we're covering the entire time period of the detail that's driving that summary. Redundant relationships. I've seen this a few times, and I just don't know what people are thinking when they do this. But basically, what they do is, I'm looking at activity 5 and say, yes, it's preceded by activity 4, but you know what? It also can't start until activity 2, 3, and 1 are also done. So, in this example, and I've seen this happen, activity 2 has 1 predecessor. Activity 3 has 2. Activity 4 has 3. This is a lot of work, and it really ties down a schedule unnecessarily. I mean, the way that most scheduling tools work is if activity 2 doesn't complete, the logic, if you use retained logic, the logic still flows through to activity 5 and will push out activity 5 even if activities 3 and 4 are complete. So I really don't need that redundant logic. As long as I use retained logic as my calculation mode in P6. Multiple relationships, 2 relationships of a different type between 2 activities. I look for this. The most common is start to start combined with a finish to finish. Anything other than this, you should take a look at what is the intent, what are they thinking. This could be a classic crew chase, where framing is followed by a rough electric, which is followed by drywall, and so forth. And this is why, on a lot of linear projects, you end up with a lot of critical activities. And so what happens here is if one of these activities gets delayed, you won't have this. Okay? Here's an example where I've got starts to starts, but nothing tying down the finish of these activities. So this is what can happen to you. And this is actually something that happened on a project where the first 2 days started and that crew moved on to the next activity and then started that, finished their work and moved on. But then the follow-on work on those activities was never started, and so those activities were being delayed. And you can see that my activity 4 and activity 5 still haven't been impacted, even though I've got delays in activity 1 and 2. When I came across this, the contractor had gone to the owner and said, well, the Primavera scheduling isn't working because I'm delayed and the schedule doesn't show it. Well, the schedule doesn't show it because you haven't tied down the finish of these activities using an accepted practice like this. Now, in this actual example, the contractor, instead of tying down the finishes of each activities, they went out and hired a claims consultant who created a milestone and tied all of the activities to the same milestone. And then he came back and said, Primavera still broke. It doesn't recognize my delay. Go figure. Relationship metrics, illogical relationships. Sometimes a scheduler will take an activity and link it to a successor just because that's where they want to see the end of that activity cut off. He's looking at a time frame. So an example might be a concrete mix submittal that's linked to ordering paint. It may not make any sense to the reviewer, so you need to check on it. By the same token, installing concrete at area A followed by installing concrete in area B, this would be what I call a preferential relationship that is used to position the activities so that the same crew can first do area A, then do area B. These preferential relationships should be addressed in the narrative because once the contractor gets on the project and starts moving crews around, the sequence of the work can change, and this is actually one of the most common causes of out-of-sequence work on a project where, the crew started area A, ran into a problem, so immediately moved over to area B and did that, then came back to area A. Happens all the time. It's preferential logic. Lead lag metrics. So the purpose of the justification of a lead, and in P6 we call it lag, but some software call it lag. If I'm looking backwards, it's lead. If I'm looking forward, it's lag. Whatever you want to call it, I'm using the word lead lag. To control when a successor starts based on when a predecessor starts or finishes. I could put lead and lag anywhere, but whatever reason I have should be discussed in the narrative. I also look for leads and lags that exceed the durations of my predecessors and successors. These I'm very suspicious of, and I want to know more about them. Leads and lags are a common occurrence in construction schedules and precedence diagramming. Okay, it's one of the reasons why precedence diagramming took over for arrow diagramming on construction schedules, because we often have crew chases where we want to stagger the starts of activities. Okay, the problem is that leads or lags function like activities. They have a start and they have a finish. They may even have a different calendar than the predecessor and successors. But they are activities that don't have descriptions. And the other problem is if you're planning to do a risk analysis on the schedule, leads and lags cannot be impacted. They can't have a range of durations when you do a risk analysis. So what we recommend is if you're going to use lags or leads to space activities out, especially long duration, it's better to put an activity in there that has a description of what it is. You talk about how the duration was determined, and then this also allows for a range of durations when you do a risk analysis on the schedule. They just communicate a lot better. Constraint metrics. This can sometimes get confusing, and I'm kind of in a hurry to get here because I've got some graphics that I put together to help understand how these work. Zero free float I think of as late as convenient. So I don't want to have the material get there until just before it has to be installed. The problem with that, however, is if I delay my delivery to a critical activity, then my delivery becomes critical as well, so I need to watch that. Zero total float can force an activity to be critical that's not on the critical path. I once saw a schedule submittal where all of the owner's review activities showed up as critical, even though the predecessors and successors had all kinds of float, and it turned out that all of the owner's review activities had zero total float on them. And so those constraints will override and they will show up as critical, and they need to be justified before you just accept them. Expected finish, I use expected finish a lot with long duration activities. Maybe I got a commitment from a supplier that it's going to be ready for delivery on a certain date, so I put that date in. The benefit of an expected finish constraint is once the activity starts, as the dated date moves forward through each update, it automatically adjusts my remaining duration to preserve the expected finish until we go by it, of course. Okay, but it should be justified in a narrative that this is the basis of that date, is, you know, maybe something I got from a vendor. Mandatory dates are oftentimes misused because they're misunderstood. So let's take a look at what happens when I use a mandatory start on an activity. Okay, so what happens here is the early and late dates of this activity will be set there. So even though this is a path that has some float on it, you'll notice that this activity 5 has 0 float on it. So let's see what happens when we status. And in this case, activity 1 has been delayed, and it's pushing out activities 2 and activity 4. And what happens is the predecessor to our mandatory start activity is allowed to push past it, but the mandatory start activity does not move and maintains 0 float. There's no negative float on the activity, but it does force negative float backwards on its predecessors. So a mandatory start or mandatory finish activity is not going to move. Now with a start on constraint, same thing. It ends up being critical because of this start on date that I give it. I've got some delay in front of it. So you'll notice that the predecessor pushes out, but it also pushes out the start on activity. So the start on activity moves, but forces negative float backwards to all of the predecessor. Start on or after. You'll notice here up on top that this activity 5 could start on Monday, but it's being pushed out to Tuesday, which is December 1st. And you'll notice that it's not critical because it's recognizing the float that it has, because it could start after that date. And in this case here, we do have a delay before it. Predecessor pushes it out, but it's still within positive float, so we're maintaining positive float. So this is very convenient. This is when we expect to start the work, but you know, it could start a little bit later. Now on a start on or before, it's a little bit different because we still have a December 1st constraint on this activity, even though it's being allowed to start on Monday the 30th because it's start on or before. Same thing, I've got some delays before it. It's pushed out, but because it had to start before December 1st, it's forcing 3 days of negative float. The difference between the 4th and the 1st is forcing negative float on its predecessor. Here is finish constraints. Rather than redoing the graphics, because it's the same principle, just explaining that it's the same principle. Finish on or before, by the way, is most commonly used constraint for finish milestones. So if the work finishes early, it's allowed to move up, but it won't allow it to be pushed any later without generating negative float on its predecessors. And lastly, we suggest that you use activity notebooks to document your justification. And of course, those activity notebooks could be printed out to be your part of your narrative. Okay. All right, we've got 10 minutes, so I've got some time here to jump into a couple of things that I wanted to show you. So I'm going to go into EPPM, and I'm going to show you check schedule. So I'm going to jump over to the Harbor Point Assisted Living Center project. Hopefully this thing didn't disconnect while it was sitting here. Okay, doesn't seem to have. And I'm switching to the activity screen. There we go. So I have to be in a project. I've got a project open, and I can go to the action menu. This is P6 EPPM. And I go to the run menu. This is only available in EPPM. It's not available in Pro, although I haven't checked 15 0.2, but I doubt if it's there. So here's what it's going to check. This basically matches the DCM 14-point check, but I can specify the values that I want to meet, and I can tell it whether something gets included or not. So if I run check schedule, so it gives me a summary. I've got some negative lags. There they are. I've got some long legs. There they are. So it very quickly will get me to where I have problems, allows me to check it. And that's built right into P6 EPPM. Let's also take a quick look at Ron Winter's Schedule Analyzer Pro. Okay, good. Ron's help video is about to come up, but we squashed that pretty quick. So I ran the report. I'm going to take a look at it. I ran it before this, so we didn't have to wait for it to run. So this goes through and also does a check on the baseline and tells you what it finds. And of course, this data can very easily be copied and pasted into your report. And here I've got Acumen Fuse opened up. I've got my Harbor Point project. I'm going to switch over to diagnostics. I'm going to tell it to show my hierarchy, and then I'll run Fuse. And so what it's done is for the major parts of my project, because I've got it organized by WBS, so I've got some logic density. When I click on that, it actually will go into the schedule, which it's not doing for me. There we go. So that one was just one. So I've got some missing logic on one activity. I've got 8 activities that it says are insufficient detail. So whatever criteria it's using to look it up. Activities with lags. So it allows me to look at it by time period. Here I'm looking at it by metric. So there's a lot of information that's available to me with these tools. Dan, do I have the right one up on screen?
You're on the PPT, the PowerPoint.
I'm on the PowerPoint, so let me switch. Presentation view. How's that?
Yep.
Okay, so to summarize, looks like we still have some time left for questions. Original baseline metrics, that has everything to do with the quality of the schedule, not changes. So I'm not looking to see what's changed. I want to know about the quality, because whatever level of quality you allow into the original baseline schedule, you will live with that through all of your updates and your as-built schedules and your closeout. So you want to lay a good, solid foundation right off the bat. So understanding these metrics and how to use them is, to me, critical for achieving the control and minimizing conflict and confusion down the line. Dan, do we have any questions?
Yes, there were a couple of questions that were asked during the presentation. First question that was asked is, are there any tips for refreshing project baselines?
There are best practices, and I would refer you to the AACE website, not best practice, but recommended practices of how you might rebaseline. You know, one of the things that happens often is that additional detail is added. If a summary level was put in place in the original baseline, then I can add activities underneath it. And the tip, you know, that I would suggest is, let's say I have activity A400 and it spans 3 months, way out into the future. And when I get to the point of detailing that down, I'll make that original activity, I'll turn that into an LOE, and then the detail will be, you know, A400.01, .02, .03, whatever, and they drive the summary activity, which still compares to the original activity in the baseline. So that is a best practice on preserving and keeping the validity of your original baseline schedule. And all of this is covered in the Library of Recommended Practices from AACE, which we gave you the link on. I'm also including with this a link to Ron Winter's Reviewing a Baseline Schedule PDF, which is available off of his website. He gets into a lot more detail than what I could possibly cover in 40 or 45 minutes today.
All right. Next question that was submitted is, when I perform a field update on the schedule, I prefer to ask for an expected completion date for a task versus a percent complete, since percent complete can be subjective depending on who you get the status from. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's has nothing to do with an original baseline, everything to do with an update. I think any information that you can get from different perspectives, if I ask someone how many days left and ask him what date he expects to finish, and they don't coincide with one another, then I need to get that straightened out.
Next question. For activity descriptions, do you recommend an action word to start the description, or maybe a location or area to start the description?
I'd say whatever you're comfortable with. I'll usually go with an action word like erect forms, and then I'll code the activities. And there's ways in Excel where I can concatenate, let's say, location descriptions onto the activity descriptions to make it easier to build my descriptions when I'm building the schedule. So I usually start out with what's happening, followed by where it's supposed to happen.
Next question. Do you find the standard parameters in Acumen Fuse to define green, yellow, and red acceptable in most cases, or do you customize them?
Depending on the situation, the client, the type of project, they should be customized. We have somebody in our team that specializes in running risk analysis and is a specialist on Acumen, and I know he has a range of different settings that he uses when Daryl runs those reports. Excellent.
Next question. Will schedule?
And I think that'll also be a future. We'll do a future webinar on that where we'll have Daryl actually run a webinar about using Acumen for diagnosis analysis and running a risk on it.
Do you think check schedule will be part of a P6 Pro local install going forward?
No. No, it uses web services, and P6 Pro doesn't support. P6 Pro is a Windows tool.
All right, and we had one more question submitted. Can you go over the best practices for deleting or adding activities in updates while maintaining the validity of the baseline?
I don't like deleting activities. I think you should lay the foundation for expanding your activities in the original baseline. As I mentioned before, if I have an activity A100 that I want to detail down in the future, I will leave A100 in the subsequent update, make it into a hammock or a level of effort activity, and then I will build the detail under it for A100.01, .02, .03, whatever.
One more had just come in, Don, and this will be our last question because we're just getting to the top of the hour. It is Claim Digger still supported in P6, and could you comment on its use?
Claim Digger is still supported in P6 Pro, and it's useful. It's just the size of some of our schedules. The information that this creates is overwhelming. It's one of the things I like about Acumen is it uses a graphic interface to kind of point out the green, yellow, red, where I need to. It makes it easier to communicate to a client that here, this is red because you've got these many lags. And the challenge is taking all of the detail that a Claim Digger produces and putting it in a format that a client can understand. When someone comes back to me and says, oh, I got 90 pages of a claim digger report I need to have the client resolve before I run a risk analysis, well, guess what? That client's just going to throw that in the garbage and move on to somebody else that has a different approach to doing it. So could be too much detail, but I still use it now and then to see what I come up with. Okay, if there's any more questions, we will include them in the Excel file that we send out to all the registrants. These are some events coming up. Friday, December 11th, we're going to be doing a presentation on ASTA Power Project for any of you that might be interested in ASTA. We're sponsoring that at the Holiday Inn in Santa Ana, and one of our team will be doing a demonstration on ASTA and reviewing how it differs from P6, pluses and minuses. Also, you got the CPM conference coming up the end of January in New Orleans. For people on the West Coast, the Western Winter Workshop this year is going to be in Indian Wells in March. And then for people on the East Coast, we've got the Northeast Total Cost Management Symposium is the end of March outside of Philadelphia. So we hope to see you at those events. And if you don't get our newsletter and want to, then just go to drmcnatty.com/news and be glad to add you to the list. So I want to thank everybody for participating. I hope you found this useful. Goodbye.